my music. They tend to group it with Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein, which is fine with me because I love both of those composers. I did when I wrote this piece, and I still do. I wasn't really thinking about them a lot when I wrote this piece, but I grew up playing their music and listening to it, so for sure, people tell me it's a very American-sounding piece, which makes me happy because I think I'm very American. I think that's a good thing, by the way. Yeah, so I think certainly those two composers for sure. When I hear it now, I mean, the piece is 13 years old now, 12 or 13 years old, wrote it in 2002. When I hear it now, I hear a really strong jazz influence. I hear a little bit of rock and roll. And I actually hear a little bit of French music. I spent a couple summers studying in Paris about 5 years before I wrote this piece. And a lot of 19th century romantic music, composers like Sibelius, Brahms, people like that. A kind of strange mix of all those different musics, which I think, again, is for me and many of my colleagues what it means to be an American composer, because you're growing up in one country learning a tradition of European art music from the previous couple centuries. But you're listening to rock and jazz and playing those things and studying those things. So it's kind of this big soup that gets mixed together and sometimes comes out sounding like that. Anybody else? Sir, in the back there.
Yeah, maybe I can hear it in my head, but I'm wondering what the sextet performance sounds like versus this orchestral.
Yeah, this is this is actually the first performance of my music in Chicago ever, which I'm very happy about. Great to be in this wonderful city. Phenomenal ensemble here, and Renee is a real dynamo in the city. I've been going all over with her for a week now, so bravo to that. It's funny because the original version of the piece is for 6 instruments. It's for flute, clarinet, violin, cello, piano, and percussion. Then the year after I wrote that version, I wrote a version for 45-piece chamber orchestra, which has got all the instruments you have, strings, winds, brass, and percussion. About 45 players. We came up with 20, I think, for this one, right, Renee? So when I hear this piece, I think I said in the rehearsal, it sounds like the sextet version on steroids. Sort of. It's a really aggressive version. I actually love it because it has qualities of, when you have more string players like we do here, the stuff at the end, the quiet lyrical music at the end sounds much richer and fuller, more orchestral, which I love. But because it's still relatively small, it still has a kind of very precise chamber music-y sort of feel, and all the really rhythmic kind of crazy stuff at the beginning of the piece sounds really tight and precise because it's not too bulky at 20. So it's a kind of happy medium, and I hope it gets done again. I've got 3 versions of this piece now, so I'm very happy about that, actually. Yeah. Great, thank you. Anybody else? Sir?
What was the inspiration for this particular piece?
Yeah, the title of the piece is In Shadows, in Silence, and I think when I started writing this piece, well, let me do it the other way around. The piece was originally written for a group right here in Chicago called 8th Blackbird, which has now become one of the world's most famous contemporary music groups. When I met them, they were relatively brand new. So they asked me to write this piece for them for a festival in Norfolk, Connecticut that we did together in the summer of 2002. So the initial inspiration was the chance to write a piece for them and to go to the festival and have the performance. It was a little bit strange the way that they wanted to work. They wanted me to write a minute and a half or 2 minutes of the piece first as a preview for them so they could gauge how difficult it would be and how much time they need to spend on my piece versus the other works in the program. And then they wanted me to finish the other 7 or 8 minutes of the piece later on before I got there. So the initial inspiration was to get them a minute and a half of music. But the title itself, In Shadows and Silence, Shadows and Silences in this piece were for me ways that I was accessing memories of earlier parts of my life. Right around the time I wrote this piece, and I'm not really sure why, I was having very vivid and very strong, powerful memories of my childhood and earlier parts of my life. I was 32 when I wrote this piece. So things from my teenage years and my 20s were coming back to me in a very strong way. But only at specific times. And I was living in Brooklyn when I wrote this piece. And I remember when I would walk to the subway on the way to school and work, it was very dark out and things were sort of cast in shadow. And I would look into the shadows and I'd start to hear this piece. And when I would come home at night, sort of the same effect in the twilight. And also when I'd go to sleep at night, I'd put my head in the pillow and it would get very quiet. Even, actually Brooklyn can get quiet really late at night. And I would start to hear music, So for me, the silences and the shadows were like, I call them sort of like portals or gateways that took me into my memories, and from those memories came the music of the piece. So I think when you hear the piece, if you're trying to make sense of what you just heard, the very rhythmic and colorful and active music, the fast music at the beginning of the piece, sort of represents for me the busyness of our everyday lives and sort of living in the moment and remembering who we have to text and when we have to get to work and what we're supposed to eat and how much to exercise and who we have to call later. You know, and then how that kind of can all very quickly vanish away very suddenly when we have a very strong, powerful memory that takes us back to another part of our life. Things get very still and quiet and calm and peaceful. So at the end of the piece, all the fast music kind of gradually fades away and becomes, sort of fading into the background. And then this other music with the string chorale that you heard these guys play so beautifully, that music comes to the foreground. And the thing I like about the piece is that their music and the strings has been there all along, but it was underneath the surface of the piece. The very bright and brilliantly colored stuff, and you might not have noticed at the beginning, but at the end it comes into the foreground, and then you hear this very lyrical, quiet ending to the